Chapter 15. The Ruins at Adare. We threw back the shutters next morning to a cold and dreary day of misting rain, and after a look at it, Betty elected to spend it before a cosy fire in our great, high-ceilinged room. I have wondered since if our hotel at Limerick was not one of those handsome 18th century mansions brought by the hard necessities of time to the use of passing travellers. It is difficult to explain the gorgeousness of some of its rooms on any other theory. Ours was a very large one, with elaborate ceiling mouldings and panelled walls and a mantel of carved marble, which Betty inspected longingly. She could see it, I fancy, in her own drawing room, and perhaps its beauties had something to do with her decision to spend the day in front of it. There were 2 or 3 pictures I wanted to take, one of the old castle and another of the crooked little lane I had wandered through the night before. So I set forth to get them, along busy George Street, with its bright shops, and then across the river to Englishtown, and so to the castle front. I found it very hard to get anything like a satisfactory picture of it, because the parapet of the new bridge is in the way, and because the angle of my lens was not wide enough to take in both the towers. I did the best I could, took a last look at the treaty stone, but forbore to add to its fame by photographing it, and then traversed again the quaint old streets with their ramshackle houses, and so came to the little lane. The town, as I came through it, had been full of market carts drawn by ragged donkeys and driven by shawled women, and I loitered about for a time, hoping that one of them would come this way, and so add a touch of human interest to my picture. A painter was busy giving one of the thatched houses a coat of whitewash, only it wasn't whitewash, properly speaking, because a colouring matter had been added to it, which made it a vivid pink. This pink wash is very popular in Ireland, and, varied sometimes by a yellow wash, adds a high note to nearly every landscape. I talked with the man a while, and then the rain came down more heavily, and I slipped into a cobbler's shop for shelter. It would be difficult to imagine anything more comfortless and primitive than that interior. The shop occupied one of the 2 rooms of the family home, bare little rooms with dirt floors and tiny windows, and no furniture except the most necessary. Somebody has said that there are 2 pieces of furniture always worthy of veneration, the table and the bed, but I doubt if even that philosopher could have found anything to venerate in the specimens which this house contained. The table was a rude affair of rough boards, with one corner supported by a box in lieu of a leg, and the bed was a mere pile of rags on a sort of low shelf in one corner. What sort of fare was set forth upon that table, and what sort of rest the bed afforded, was not difficult to imagine. The cobbler was tapping away at a pair of shoes, trying to mend them, and sadly they needed it. Indeed, they were such shoes as no self-respecting tramp would wear in America, and I could not but suspect that the cobbler had fished them from a garbage heap somewhere, and was trying, as a sort of speculation, to make them worth a few pennies. 2 or 3 blocks of turf smoked and flared in a narrow fireplace, and, as always, a black pot hung over them, with some sort of mess bubbling inside it. The cobbler's wife sat on a stool before the fire contemplating the boiling pot gloomily, and a dirty child, of undeterminable sex, played with the scraps of leather on the floor. I apologised for my intrusion, but the atmosphere of the place was not genial. I fancied they resented my presence, as I should have done had our positions been reversed, and so, as soon as the downpour had slackened a bit, I pressed a penny into the baby's fist and took myself off. The cobbler, suddenly softened, followed me outside to see me take the picture, and perhaps to be in it. But that picture was a failure, all spotted by the rain. I intended going to Adare, a little town not far away, said to possess a most remarkable collection of ruins. But it was yet an hour till train time, and I spent it exploring the town back of the railway station. I found it a most picturesque collection of crooked streets and quaint houses, and my advent was frankly treated as a great event by the gossips leaning over their half-doors. How eager they were to talk! I should have liked to stop and talk to all of them, but when I got ready to take a picture of the very crookedest street, their interest in my proceedings was so urgent and humorously expressed that I lost my head and forgot to pull the slide, a fact I didn't realise until I had bade them goodbye and was walking away. And then I was ashamed to go back and take another. The train for Adare was waiting beside the platform when I got to the station, and I carefully selected a vacant compartment and clambered aboard. And then a guard came along and laughingly told me I would have to get out, because that car was reserved for a mothers' union, which was going to Adare to hold a meeting. So I got out and waited on the platform till the union arrived, some 20 or 30 comfortable-looking matrons, in high spirits, which the miserable weather did not dampen in the least. Irish meetings are held, I suppose, just the same, rain or shine. It was Simeon Ford who remarked that, if the Scotch knew enough to go in when it rained, they would never get any outdoor exercise. This is equally true of the Irish, only in Ireland one doesn't need to go in, for sure 'tis a soft rain that does nobody any harm. Adare is about 10 miles from Limerick, and the road hither runs along the valley of the Shannon, with its lush meadows and lovely woods, veiled that day in a pearly mist of rain. As usual, the station is nearly a mile from the town, and as I started to walk it, I saw a tall old man coming along behind me, and I waited for him. "'Tis a bad day," I said. "It is so," he agreed, "and it's a long walk I have before me, for my house will be 2 miles beyond the village. They tell me there are some fine ruins in the village." "There are so," and then he looked at me more attentively. "You're not a native of these parts?" he asked at last. "No," I said, "I'm from America." "From America?" he echoed incredulously. "Yes, from the state called Ohio." "Think of that now," he cried, "and I can understand every word you say. Why, glory be to God, you speak fairer than the old woman up here along who has never crossed the road." I should have liked to hear more about this remarkable old woman, but he gave me no chance with his many questions about America. He had a son in New Jersey, he said, and the boy was doing well, and sent a bit of money home on Christmas and such like. It was a wonderful place, America. Ah, if you were not so old. So, talking in this manner, we came to the town, and he pointed out the inn to me, opposite a picturesque string of thatched cottages nestling among the trees, and bade me Godspeed and went on his way. And I suppose that night before the fire he told of his meeting with a wanderer from far-off America, and how well he could understand his language. I went on to the inn, which was a surprisingly pretty one, new and clean and well kept, and I took off my wet coat and sat down in the cosy bar before a lunch which tasted as good as any as I have ever eaten. And then I lit my pipe and drew it before the fire, and asked the pretty maid who served me how to get to the ruins. They were all, it seemed, inside the domain of the Earl of Dunraven, the entrance to which was just across the road, and it was necessary that I should have an entrance ticket, which the maid hastened to get for me from the proprietor of the inn. When she gave it to me, I asked the price, and was told there was no charge, as the Earl of Dunraven was always glad for people to come to see the ruins. All honour to him for that. So, it was with a very pleasant feeling about the heart that I presently crossed the road and surrendered a portion of my ticket to a black-eyed girl at the gatehouse, and she told me how to go to get to the ruins, and hoped I wouldn't be soaked through. But I didn't mind the rain, it only added to the beauty of the park. Besides, I was thinking of Silken Thomas. Have you ever heard of Silken Thomas, 10th Earl of Kildare? Probably not. Yet he was a great man in his day. Not so great as his grandfather, that greatest of the Geraldines, whose trial for treason before Henry VII is a thing Irishmen love to remember. "This man burned the cathedral at Cashel," said the prosecutor, "and we will prove it." "Spare your evidence," said the Earl. "I admit that I set fire to the church, but it was only because I thought the Archbishop was inside." "All Ireland cannot rule this man," cried one of his opponents. "Then, by God, this man shall rule all Ireland," said the King, and Kildare was made Lord Lieutenant, and went back to Dublin in triumph. It was in the 13th century that Adare came into possession of this mighty family, and the second Earl built a great castle here, on the site of an older one, which had belonged to the dispossessed O'Donovans. The first Earl had already built near a monastery for the Augustinians, and another Earl and his pious wife built yet a handsomer one for the Franciscans, so that here was a citadel and sanctuary for them when they grew weary of fighting, or when the tide of battle went against them. It was a Kildare who led the northern half of Ireland against the southern at the great battle of Knockdoe, where Irishmen slew each other by the thousands, while the English looked on and chuckled in their sleeves. And after that the Kildares waxed so powerful that Wolsey, the great minister of the 8th Henry, took alarm at their overvaulting ambition and caused the head of the house, the 9th Earl, to be summoned to London. He went, unwillingly, though he had been given every assurance of safety. And his misgivings proved well founded, for here he was at once imprisoned in the Tower. He left behind him in Ireland his son, Silken Thomas, so called from the richness of his attire and retinue, a youth of 21. And when the news came that the old Earl had been put to death, Silken Thomas, deeming it credible enough, renounced his allegiance to England, marched into Dublin, and threw down his sword of state before the Chancellor and Archbishop in St. Mary's Abbey, and then rode boldly forth again, none daring to stop him. But it came to naught, for a great English force wore him out in a long campaign, seduced his allies from him, and finally persuaded him to yield on condition that his life should be spared. He sailed for England, assured of a pardon, was arrested as soon as he landed, and was beheaded and drawn and quartered on Tower Hill, together with 5 of his kinsmen. So ended the haughty Geraldines. The estate was confiscated, and the castle, after being besieged by Desmonds and O'Connells, by Irish and by English, was finally taken by Cromwell's men and destroyed, and they also perhaps put the finishing touches to the monasteries. That was the wild old story I was thinking of as I made my way along the winding road, over a beautiful little stream in which I could see the trout lurking, and then across a golf ground to the ivy-draped ruins of the old abbey of the Franciscans, built by the Geraldines in the heyday of their power. It is a beautiful cluster of buildings, with a graceful square tower rising high above them, and they are in excellent preservation, lacking only the roofs and a portion of a gable here and there. Even the window tracery is, for the most part, intact. The interior of the church is of unusual richness and beauty, abounding in delicate detail, recessed altar tombs, richly carved sedilia, arched vaults, graceful mouldings, and the window traceries are very pure and lovely. Here, as at Muckross, the cloisters are especially beautiful, and are perfectly preserved. They are lighted on 2 sides by pointed arches arranged in groups of 3, while on the side next the church the arches are grouped in pairs, and the 4th side is closed in by a lovely arcade, with double octagonal columns. Here, also as at Muckross, the friars planted a yew tree in the centre of the court, and it is now a venerable giant. Whether it is as deadly as the Muckross yew, I do not know. Beyond the cloisters are the refectory and domestic offices and dormitories, all well preserved, and repaying the most careful scrutiny. I don't know when I have been more ecstatically happy than when, after examining all of this beauty, I sat myself down under an arch in the very midst of it, and smoked a pipe, and gazed, and gazed. I tore myself away at last, and made my way across the meadow to the ruins of the castle, which I could see looming above the trees by the river. Right on the bank of the river it stands, and at one time there was a moat all around it, which the river fed. One can see traces of the moat even yet, with the fosse beyond, and there is enough left of the castle to show how great and strong the citadel of the Geraldines was. There is a high outer wall, all battlemented, pierced by a single gate, and then an inner ward, also with a single gate, flanked by heavy defending towers. Within this looms the ultimate place of refuge, the mighty donjon, 40 feet square, with walls of tremendous strength, and flanking towers, and every device for defence, so that one wonders how it was ever taken. One can still go up by the narrow stone stair, and from the top look down upon these walls within walls, and fancy oneself back in the Middle Ages, with their pageantries and heroisms and picturesque mummeries. And one can see too how hard and comfortless life was then, save for the few who held wealth and power in their mailed fists. The good old times. Not much. The sad, cruel, gruesome, selfish, treacherous old times, whose like, thank heaven, will never be seen again upon this earth. The rain was pouring down in sheets as I left the castle, but I could not forbear going back again to the friary for a last look at it. And then I tramped happily back along the road to the gate, and the black-eyed girl was there to welcome me, and to say how sorry she was that the day was so bad. But I did not think it bad. I thought it beautiful, and said so, only I was afraid my photographs wouldn't be worth reproducing. And then the girl asked me if I wouldn't come in and sit by the fire a bit, and we had a little gossip, of course, about America. She had a married sister in New York, she said, and she hoped some day to join her. And then she told me that the cottage next door was where the famous Adare cigarettes were made, an industry started by the Earl, who grew the tobacco on his place. I stopped in to see the factory, and found 4 girls rolling the cigarettes, and a man blending the tobaccos. He told me that the Earl had planted 25 acres with tobacco, and that it did very well, but it was not used alone, as it was too dark, but blended with the lighter Maryland, brought from America. I bought a packet of the cigarettes in the interest of this narrative, but they did not seem to me in any way extraordinary. I went on again and stopped in at the parish church, which was at one time a Trinitarian friary, or White Abbey, founded 700 years ago. It was falling into ruins when the Earl, who seems omnipotent in these parts, restored it and fitted it up as a church and turned it over to the Catholics. There is a big school attached to it now, and, as I entered the grounds, a white-coiffed nun who was sitting at a window, looking over some papers, fled hastily. The church itself is chiefly remarkable for a very beautiful 5-lighted window over the altar. Just outside is a handsome Celtic cross, surmounting the fountain where the villagers get their water. There was a store farther down the street, and I stopped in to get some postcards. It was the most crowded store I ever saw. The ceiling hung with tinware, the shelves heaped with merchandise of every kind, and the floor so crowded with boxes and barrels that there was scarcely room to squeeze between them. I remarked to the proprietor that he seemed to carry a large stock, and he explained that he tried to have everything anybody would want, for it was foolish to let any money get away. While we were talking, a girl came in to sell some eggs. She had them in a basket, and the man took them out, but instead of counting them, he weighed them. I went on back to the station after that, through the driving rain, and I was very wet by the time I got there. Wet on the outside, that is, but warm and dry and happy underneath. And at the station, I found 3 men, who were engaged in a heated argument as to whether a man weighed any more after he had eaten dinner than he did before. One of the men contended very earnestly that one could eat the heartiest of meals without gaining an ounce of weight, if only one took the precaution of drinking a mug or 2 of beer or porter with the meal, since the drink lightened the brain and so neutralized the weight of the food in the stomach. He asserted that he had seen this proved more than once, and that he was willing to bet on it. He was also willing to bet that he could put 12 pennies into a brimming glass of stout, without causing it to spill. As the village was a mile away, there was no place to get a glass of stout, and tried this interesting experiment. And then one of the men, looking at my wet coat and dripping cap, asked me if I'd been fishing. No, I said. I was tramping around through the domain looking at the ruins and trying to get some pictures of them, and I tapped my camera. He looked at the camera, and then he looked at me. Where would you be from? He asked. From America. From America? He echoed in surprise. Ah well, he added after a moment's thought, that do seem a long way to come just to get a few photos. I couldn't help but laughing as I agreed that it did, but I had never thought of it in just that way. And then he told me that he had 5 brothers in America, but he himself had been in the army, and was minded to enlist again. In the army, one got enough to eat, and warm clothes to wear, and a tight roof to sleep under, which was more than most men were able to do in Ireland. The Mothers' Union presently arrived, very wet, but very happy. I was curious to know what they had discussed at their meeting, and what conclusions they had reached, but the train pulled in a moment later, and I had no time to make any inquiries. If Betty had been along, I think I should have persuaded her to attend that meeting. But I found her very warm and comfortable before her fire back at Limerick, and I confess that I was glad to get out of my wet things and sit down in front of it. At 9:25 that night, when we supposed that most of Limerick was in bed, we heard the sound of music and the tramp of many feet in the street below, and looked out to see a band going past, followed by a great crowd of men tramping silently along in the wet. Ordinarily I would have rushed out to see what was up, but I was tired and the fire felt very good, and so I sat down again in front of it. I have been sorry since, for I suspect it was a Home Rule meeting, and Limerick has a great reputation for shindies. Perhaps O'Connell, journeyman tailor, made a speech. If he did, I am sorrier still, for I am sure it was a good one. There was one thing more at Limerick we wished to see, the great butter factory of the Messrs. Cleeve, on the other side of the Shannon. We had already seen, rumbling through the streets of Limerick, the heavy steam trams carrying enormous iron tanks, which collect the milk from the country for miles around. From 10,000 cows, someone told us. And we had seen so few industries in Ireland that it seemed worthwhile to inspect this one. So, next morning, we walked down to the waterfront, past the towering empty warehouses, to the swing bridge which Cleeve wants to close, so that his trams can get across the Shannon without going away around by the castle. The bridge, a very fine one, was named originally after Wellesley, but has been rechristened after Patrick Sarsfield, in whose honour the street which leads up from it is also named. The swivel which allows boats to pass, and which isn't strong enough to carry the weight of Cleeve's trams, is on the Limerick side, and just beyond it is a statue which one naturally thinks is Sarsfield's, until one reads the inscription at its base and finds it is a presentment of a certain Lord Fitzgibbon, who was killed in the charge of the Light Brigade. Beyond that, the bridge stretches away across the wide and rapid stream, by far the biggest river in Ireland. The butter factory is not far off, and we entered the office and told the clerk who came forward that we should like to see the place. He asked for my card, had me write my American address on it, and then disappeared with it into an inner room. There was a delay of some minutes, and finally one of the Messrs. Cleeve came out, my card in his hand. After greeting us quite cordially, he looked at the camera which I had under my arm, and asked if I expected to take any pictures of the place. "Why, no," I said. "I hadn't thought of doing so. I certainly won't if you don't want me to." "Are you interested in the butter business?" "Only as a private consumer." "Or in the condensed milk business?" "No," I said promptly. "Neither of us is interested in that, even as consumers." And then, seeing that he still hesitated, I explained that we were just travelling Americans who had heard about the factory and thought we should like to see it, but that, if it was against the rules, he had only to say so, and it would be all right. "It isn't against the rules," he explained. "In fact, we welcome visitors, only we have to be careful. We have some secret processes, especially with our condensed milk, which we wouldn't care to have our competitors know about. But I'm sure you're all right," he added, and called a clerk and told him to show us everything. Most interesting we found it, for 23 million gallons of milk are used there every year, and are converted not only into butter and condensed milk, but into buttons and cigarette holders, and all sorts of things for which celluloid is commonly used. It was in this use of one of the byproducts of the business, casein, so our guide explained, that much of the profit was made, since both the butter and the condensed milk had to be sold in a very close margin. The factory is a very complete one, making everything it uses. Its own cans and boxes, its own labels, its own cartons, its containers of every kind and shape, as well as their contents. And the machinery with which this is done is very intricate and ingenious. Our guide said that one of the principal hazards of the business was the likelihood that some new machine would be invented at any time to displace the old ones, and would have to be purchased in order to keep abreast of competition. We saw the long troughs into which the milk is poured and strained and heated to pasteurize it, and then run through the separators. In the next room were the great churns, from which the yellow butter was being taken, and beyond were the mechanical kneaders, which worked out the superfluous water and worked in the salt. And then the butter was put through a machine which divided it into blocks weighing 1 pound or 2 pounds, and then each of these blocks was carefully weighed to be sure that it was a full weight, and if it wasn't, a little dab of butter was added before it was wrapped up and placed in the carton. And during all these processes, it was never touched by any human finger. On the floor above were the great copper retorts in which the milk was being condensed by boiling. We looked in through a little isinglassed opening and could see it seething like a volcano. And still higher up were the machines which turned the hardened casein, which would otherwise be wasted, into buttons and novelties of various kinds. The place seemed very prosperous and well managed, and so our guide assured us was doing well. We were glad to find one such place in Southern Ireland. Of course, there are many others, and perhaps the impression I have given of Limerick does the town injustice, for it is a busy place. It is famous for its bacon, to the making of which 10,000 pigs are sacrificed weekly. It used also to be famous for its lace, worked by hand on fine net. But Limerick lace is made almost everywhere nowadays, except at Limerick, although there is a successful school there, I believe, in one of the convents. The name of the town has also passed into the language as that of a distinctive 5-line stanza, which Edward Lear made famous, and of which such distinguished poets as Rudyard Kipling, Cosmo Monkhouse, George du Maurier, Gillette Burgess, and Carolyn Wells have written famous examples. The limerick is said to have been originally an extempore composition, a lot of people getting together and composing limericks, in turn, as a sort of game designed to while away an evening. Whether this was first done at Limerick, I don't know, but the name came from the chorus which was sung after every stanza in order to give the next person time to get his limerick into shape. "Oh, won't you come up, come up, come up, oh, won't you come up to Limerick, oh, won't you come up, come all the way up, come all the way up to Limerick." At least, that is the way I heard the chorus sung once, many years ago, without understanding in the least what it meant. The invitation, of course, is for the passing ship to enter the wide estuary of the Shannon, and sail up to Limerick's waiting quays. If the first limerick was composed at Limerick, it must have been a long time ago, and I doubt if any are produced there nowadays. We took a last stroll about the town, after we had seen the butter making, and looked at the great artillery barracks, and the big market, and the mammoth jail, and the still more mammoth lunatic asylum, where the inmates are decked out in bright red bonnets, which I should think would make them madder still. And then we walked through an open space called the People's Park, whose principal ornament is a tall column surmounted by the statue of a man named Spring Rice. Betty remarked that she had heard of spring wheat, but never of spring rice, and asked who he was, but I didn't know. And then we came to the Carnegie Library, and went inside to see what it was like. I have seldom seen a drearier place. In the reading room, a few shabby men were looking over some newspapers, but the rest of the building was deserted, except for one old man who may have been the librarian. There were few books, and the names of those which the library had were arranged in a remarkable mechanism which resembled a lot of miniature post-office boxes. And when the book was in, the name was turned out toward you, and when it was out, the card was turned blank side out. It was the most complicated thing I ever saw in a public library. I suppose after a while, when the library gets more books, this bulletin will be used only for the newer ones. But I don't imagine there is a great demand for books in Limerick. At least, mighty few seem to be in circulation. Where life's realities are so bitter, where want is always at one's heels, there is little time for intellectual recreation. How bitter those realities are, we realised, as we had never done before, on our way back to the station. For on the doorstep of a low little house sat a ragged girl of 6 or 8, cuddling her doll against her breast and crooning to it softly. And the doll was just a block of turf, with a scrap of dirty rag for a dress.